let me start. I was like 2 weeks ago invited to Ljubljana, to Slovenia, to take part in a discussion, and the topic was the crisis of art criticism, which was very interesting. Well, they really put it that way. The contemporary critical writing in the field of art and culture is in a crisis. There are several symptoms of this crisis. One of these symptoms is that art criticism disappears from media, from these columns, you know, for art criticism. Second is that the figure of art critic also loses its importance, also disappears even more, has been overshadowed by the role of curator. This is the second symptom. And yes, this is a usual complaint, but we will come to this point again back. And then they call it the dissolution of the authority of traditional professional competency. Today, as 50 years ago, then everybody could become an artist. Today it is believed that everybody can become an art critic. So these are these three symptoms. What for me was more interesting is more interesting than the real content. What is the fate of art critique today? It was the fact that they, in describing what is happening with art critique, that they use the notion of crisis. I find it very important that the notion of critique and the notion of crisis come together. Although, as you have heard, it is a crisis of art criticism itself. One can ask, okay, is that all? One could ask whether something else is also in crisis, not only art criticism. But there was no answer to this question. But this is precisely what was interesting for me. To think of the notion of critique or criticism or criticality. You recognize also already this concept. You know this concept. That this is something new. That the notion of critique reconnects with the idea of crisis, and this is what I will be talking about, because I think this is something new. But just to remind you of the fact that actually quite a long time the talk about criticism was completely disconnected from the idea of crisis. I will give you one example, like here at Goldsmiths College. You know the notion of criticality by Irit Rogov. You know, this transformation of the critique from criticism to critique and criticality, finally. Just to remind you what is the point of what is at stake. Irit means by criticality, which is what she says, a phase in cultural theory. This is how she describes it. So it's a critique, but it is something that happens within a cultural theory. The main feature of criticality is an emphasis on the present as a dimension of time, of leaving out a situation. Its goal is to actualize some of its potential rather than to reveal its faults. Criticality implies rather a positive, not a negative stance, while it has the knowledge of critique able to analyze and unveil, it also shares and leaves out the very conditions which it has successfully unveiled. Again, what is interesting for me is this idea that it is attached to the present, to very explicitly one dimension of time, and that it is like the whole this trajectory from old criticism over critique to criticality actually happens within cultural theory. Within reflection, however critical, within a reflection. And let me quote here. One is, after all, always at fault. This is a permanent and ongoing condition. Since every year we become aware of a new and hitherto unrealized perspective which illuminates further internal cultural injustice. In this sentence, you can very quickly understand what it is about, what is criticality. It and how it relates to what once was modern criticism. Criticality obviously implies radical separation of critical thinking and history, or historical reality. The latter is understood as a realm of cultural injustices, to quote again, a perspective which illuminates further internal cultural injustices. Of course it's political. Of course it's justice and injustice. It's a political question. But it's cultural injustice. Does it, how to relate it to historical reality? Where cultural injustices are created, where do they clash? In a historical reality? In a political reality? If they do, what sort of political reality it is? So, we might call it historical reality, but the question is whether there is any history in it. I mean history in terms of historical change. Rather, it looks like a permanent present in which nothing happens, at least in terms of a change, able to make a difference between the past and the future. However, something still moves in the permanent present. Present as a time dimension of criticality. It's form. And what is this? What still moves? This, as I said, awareness of cultural differences and relating injustices. Every year, writes Irit, we become aware of a new cultural difference and cultural injustice it causes. And consider the phrase, every year. This is not how we talk about history. There are events in the history. You cannot say every year something happens and repeats. Rather, this is how we talk of an empty, mechanical flow of time, a quasi-natural time that has nothing to do with a historical time. However, there is still a change in this time, but a change in the way we perceive cultural differences and their respective injustices. It is in this point we see that criticality is not simply apolitical or non-political. It is political, but in the sense of a very concrete idea, very particular idea of what politics is. Cultural differences, cultural injustices, what is it about? What sort of politics it is about? It is the so-called identity politics, based on what has been developed by Hegel and later German philosopher Axel Honneth. made out of it the whole program. This is the so-called Kampf Anerkennung, the struggle for recognition, which is again Hegelian. This, as you probably know, this relation between master and slave, in which the slave, instead of openly confronting the master, precisely by working as a slave, changes the relation and wins the recognition and at the end of the dialectical process. But the struggle for recognition is the mode. It is not struggle for social justice. It is not struggle that is typical for the old modernist historical time where classes clash, when it comes to the question how to organize society so as that we can organize it in terms of an old welfare state or in terms of a neoliberal state. But this type of political struggle that has gone with the neoliberal transformation, the struggle for social justice, this is not at stake here. So what criticality is about, what criticality deals with, it's a historical reality in which we see different identities, different, all sorts of identities in a constant struggle for recognition. But society is not at stake. Society has completely disappeared from this political imagination. So this is just I want to stress this point, that this concept of criticality and this concept of thinking about what is critique is not less political. It is political, but in a different way. In precisely what I said, different paradigm of political conflict is at stake here. So, but my question was, this is, I can say, this is how in the during the last 20, 30 years we were thinking about critique. Critique separated from historical reality, dealing not with society, but with cultural, all sorts of cultural identity, but being focused on one dimension of time, on the present. So we can call it ahistorical, or at least not interested in the history. As I said, every year it repeats. Every year without any difference. But what, to my opinion, has changed, and it is there is something new. And Mike, probably you sent these two links to these two articles published few years ago in Iflux by Dieter Rostrette, and I will comment on these articles now, claiming that they can be taken as a paradigm of a certain change in which critique reconnects with the idea of crisis, but not any crisis. But not crisis in or within cultural reflection, but the crisis of the world itself, the crisis of the historical reality. So that if you have read it, then you know that in his critical dealing with the recent developments in contemporary art, Dieter Rostrette has diagnosed a certain trend. It appears to him that a number of artists seek to define art
first and foremost in the thickness of its relationship to history. This is his word. He uses word history. Art today, he argues, finds itself more and more frequently looking back both at its own past and at the past in general. And in the first text, The Way of the Shovel, he states that, I quote, a growing number of contemporary art practices engage not only in storytelling, but more specifically in storytelling. So you see, it's not about present. We suddenly have a situation in which, as it is claimed, the most important artists today produce what is called contemporary art, are obsessed with the past, with another dimension of time. This is something new. And the next text, the title is The Historiographic Turn. What is historiographic turn? This is he coined this. He coached this diagnosis, and I quote, in the critical terms of a historiographic turn in art, apparent in the obsession with archiving, forgetfulness, memoirs and memorials, nostalgia, oblivion, reenactment, remembrance, reminiscence, retrospection, in short, with the past. That seems to drive much of the work done by some of the best and most highly regarded artists active today. This is a very strong statement. Contemporary art looks back into the past. And of course it's challenging for the idea of criticality. How to deal with the art, you know, if your dimension of time is present, how to deal with the art that is obsessed with the past. And Rochstetter mentions in this text many artists, but I would just, took my example just to mention you, also a few years ago, MoMA exhibition, and the title is Performing Histories. And it is an exhibition, I quote, of a newly acquired media works in which artists deconstruct, reassemble, and reperform history, focusing on its ambiguity and the impact of ideology on both individual and collective consciousness. What is interesting, they invited artists from all over the world, from former post-communist spaces, from Romania, from Lithuania, one of the famous artists, and especially interesting when it comes to the past, Deimantas Narkevičius from Lithuania. He took place participated in the exhibition. But also look, Kader Attia, France, Andrea Fraser, USA, again USA, Dorit Margareiter, Austria, Narkevičius, Lithuania, Marta Rosla. So it is beyond the former East-West divide. It's a certain, as Rochstetter claims, global trend of art. What is interesting, artists coming from the former communist countries, they at least have their own idea why they should deal and work with the past. Just to give you an impression of how it works, I will quote Deimantas Narkevičius, like 15 years ago. He made a work in Venice Biennial, and I quote, although my works deal with contemporary themes, the underlying problems usually go back a long time. I started my work as an artist in a period of dynamic change for my society, meaning, of course, the fall of communism, the so-called democratic revolutions 89-90. The stress and neurosis caused by all the dynamism diverted this society from both historical reflection and future concerns. So these are societies who have lost connection between past and future. They are in the present. So he calls it the stress of historical change. But what are the effects of this stress? So that you don't lose only past, connection to the past, but you are not able to create visions of the future. The ideological orientation, I quote, at creating a society above and beyond history. This was the communist ideological orientation. And the new political situation reinserted us into the rotating circuit of history, which inevitably requires a vision. But as we started working on such a vision for ourselves, things re-emerged from the past, phenomena that had been hidden under the surface of ideology. They lead us into uncharted, unwanted, unpleasant territory, muddling our vision of the future. This is a classical post-communist complaint, or I would call it typical complaint of the post-communist ideology, that the communist ideology suppressed the past, so that after the liberation, this past suddenly the possibility is opened to catch up with this missed past, so to say. But again, you see, this is an argument that is typical for the post-communist condition, for the artists coming from or dealing with the post-communist condition. But obsession with the past, artists' obsession with the past is again global. It has nothing to do with this specific post-communist condition. So back to Rostretter's diagnosis. He states that artists like Narkevicius, for instance, and he mentions him explicitly, either make artworks that want to remember or at least to turn back the tide of forgetfulness, or they make art about remembering and forgetting. He calls it meta-historical mode, an important aspect of much artwork that assumes a curatorial character. So that in this looking back, the art assumes a curatorial character. What is a realm of artistic creation and what is supposed to be a separate realm of curatorial practice somehow merge in this general retrospectivity of art. So, but what is crucial in his diagnosis, Rostretter, is the fact that he, as I said, relates this term, and this is really the crucial point, to a concrete history, or better, to the crisis, to a historical crisis, and which he clearly locates in a particular political historical event. This is what I want to say. This is what is new. And I will quote now, but just to emphasize it again. Rostretter, in criticizing art today, in criticizing contemporary art, must connect this art to a very, very to the historical reality, to a particular political events. The historiographic turn in art really took on the shape of a fully fledged trend or movement movement in art in the early years of the 21st century, concretely with the events of September 11 and subsequent war on terror. So you see, the turn, the historiographic turn, is connected to precisely to one event. We now have even a date. It's September 11, and the political consequences of this event. I quote Rohrstretter. This new historicism, and he asks himself, is that what we should call it? Historicism is actually a notion introduced in the 70s by Nietzsche, by Friedrich Nietzsche. He was also criticizing, precisely in the 70s of the 19th century, his contemporary culture at that time, also art, but also thinking for being obsessively focused on the past. And this is what he called historicism in a derogatory way. So Rohrstretter, without mentioning Nietzsche, repeats it, called the new historicism, and then defines it. This new historicism is really nothing other, like it or not, than the art of the Bush era. So you have the major trend in the contemporary art and the name of a politician, of a particular politician connected. This is interesting. This is different way of thinking what happens in contemporary art from the way how criticality was dealing with this. Criticality was not interested in particular politicians or particular events. Every day happens something. But here, not every day. Some days are much more important. And even some persons, some politicians concretely, are much more important. So important that you can name an art after a politician. The art of the Bush era. Rohrstretter, on the contrary, explicitly finds the reason for this turn to history in something we might call decadence of democratic order. This is how I explain. The inability of the masses to influence the most important decisions in the so-called Western democratic societies. Actually, he has in mind this sort of shock, the last big shock of modern democracy that actually happened. It's actually a defeat of modern democracy that happened in the February, or more precisely on the 15th. You see, I'm now, I have dates. 11 September, February 15, we are back in history. There are events. What happened on the 15th February 2003? You know, this was the start of the so-called, how do they call this? The coalition of willing wanted to liberate Iraq and the world from weapons of mass destruction, allegedly in possession of Saddam Hussein. So, and it was very interesting that masses around the world, not only elites, these masses, they understood that the cause is wrong, that it doesn't function democratically, that it is not properly legitimized, this military intervention. And masses protested. In 800 cities around the world, almost 30 million people took place in the demonstrations. In London, it was the biggest demonstration in the political history of this city. And what happened? Nothing. Or you see what happened today when you look at this space and this catastrophe of former nation states falling apart in these entity blocks fighting each other. As a consequence, it's 500,000 dead only in Iraq was the consequence of the intervention of the so-called coalition of willing, bombing Iraq in the name of the so-called Western values. I'm just reminding you. We are now. I'm talking about concrete events, about hundreds, thousands of dead and bombings, etc. And this is what defines art, what gives name to a certain epoch in art history. So, to put it short, Rohrstretter explains a new trend in contemporary art as a consequence of a crisis. One of the subtitles in the text, if you read it and you saw it, explicitly claims the desire and opportunity named crisis. So crisis is back. Explicitly it is back in critical reflection on contemporary art. And this is what is good about this text by Rohrstretter. At stake is concretely more than political crisis of contemporary democracy. People experience today, both individually and collectively, that they are helplessly exposed to the social mechanisms and political powers they have themselves created and legitimized. Democratically legitimized. They feel clearly that they have lost any ability to influence the way of the world precisely in a time when the scope of responsibility of increasingly thinner ruling elites has widened beyond measure. The elites today have the power to decide literally about life and death of the planet. And at the same time, it's not simply this powerlessness when it comes to politics. Just, people have lost any interest in politics, or I think probably something has changed, or is changing, or probably my talk wants to be also a symptom of this change. But recently, just to remind you, only 42% of people in the UK say they are interested in politics. So 60% are not interested. So the awareness of this crisis provides, in the form of a political and historical diagnosis, the rationale for authors' open critique of the historiographic turn in the contemporary art. Rohrstretter doesn't hide his disgust with what he calls an awful nostalgic bound historicist art. But what he criticizes the most is a complete loss of perspective from which to view the art world as a historical whole that needs and actively invites our thinking the bigger picture. So what he wants us to think of art within a bigger picture, within a historical reality, within a political context. Not as it was said that the criticality is, to quote Edith Rogov again, is a phase in a cultural theory. No, it's not about cultural theory. It's about push, demonstrations, bombings, about history in actu now. This is where Rohrstretter advocates for what should replace this historicist art and make a U-turn in the contemporary art production. I quote, a production of a theory of the present and a recovery and excavation of the future. The call for a theory that is a theory of the present because it is able to connect the past and the future. This is also something new. Concretely, and this is now very radical, he suggests to abandon term contemporary art altogether. He asks, contemporary with what precisely is contemporary art? So, the concept, the notion, the name of the art today, contemporary art, should be abandoned, and we should begin to try to define new isms, realisms, futurisms, etc. Isms, movements, and schools within current art production as a way to think about what it means to live in the world and make art at this time. He calls for theory to do it. Theory should invent new isms. This is what we need, and this is what critique is about: being able to conceptualize symptoms of art production into certain or into so-called isms. To sum up, Rochefrette has finally succeeded in reconnecting critique and crisis. Concretely, the art critique and the crisis of the world in which the art today is made. This itself is an important step forward. However, there are several open problems with this critique. This is how I'm not going to criticize it. I just want to open your eyes for how difficult it is to reconnect crisis and critique, and to reconnect contemporary art with the real history, with the historical reality. So there are several problems with this critique. The first is that big picture he advocates for. It seems to me that it is still too narrow, that his picture is still too narrow, both historically and theoretically. I would rather argue that the contemporary art's turn to the past is only a symptom of a general turn to the past that had happened much earlier than George Bush, at the moment which George Bush made his decision to wage war against the so-called axis of evil. This also applies to what we call the post-communist condition. It is equally marked by a turn to the past. Just to remind you that Boris Groys summed up everything what happens after the fall of communism, so-called post-communist condition, under the phrase of "back from the future." This is also the title "Zurück aus der Zukunft" of a book published on precisely with text of post-communist condition. So another question is what this turn to the past really means. Rochefrette explicitly calls it the historiographic turn, and repeatedly talks about a turn to history, even naming the art of Bush era also a new historicism. If you have read these articles, you will see that he uses notions of the past, of history, of historiography, but doesn't properly make any difference. So my question is it a history into what art looks back? Was this turn really a turn to history, as Rochefrette says? Or was it rather a turn into an opposite direction? Concretely, a turn away from history to what is called memory. I will quote, probably you know, a French historian, Pierre Nora, directly the quote: "Memory has taken on a meaning so broad and all-inclusive that it tends to be used purely and simply as a substitute for history, and to put the study of history at the service of memory. At stake is, as he writes, profound change in our relation to the past. Not only has the historian, professional historian, lost the monopoly he traditionally enjoyed in interpreting the past, the collective meaning of his knowledge has evaporated, or better, it has moved to memory. The time in which there were a collective history and individual memory, in which the historian alone was supposed to deliver the truth of the past, this time is over. In manufacturing the past, I quote Nora, today, historian must share his role with others, with the judge, the witness, the media, the legislator, and also with the artist. It is memory now that has acquired collective meaning. It is actually quite old collective memory. It's the concept of Maurice Halbwachs. It's already 100 years old. But the turn to the past, general turn to the past, not of the contemporary art after September 11, but general turn to the past is something that I will very precisely tell you when this happens. This is this, according to Noah, this turn to the past actually happens during the 70s, and he mentions 3 events that have that at that time generally changed our relation to the past. The first 73, it's the first oil crisis. The year 73 is the year we can understand as a certain threshold. The optimism of the post-war era after 45 has, after the oil crisis, disappeared. This belief in a constant development within the framework of industrial modernity, this belief has disappeared with the oil crisis 73. The second, what is very interesting, a second symptom was a symptom. What was the way how France, especially French historians, changed the way of understanding French history. 78, it's around 200 years after the French Revolution. François Furet writes his book on the French Revolution, Bronzer la Révolution Française, in which he very directly states the French Revolution is finally over. It's over now in 1978, after 200 years. And what happens? France discovers that it is not, that French nation is not only 200 years old, but 1,000 years old. And that the French Revolution is only one event among so many events in its history. And that is the importance of the French Revolution disappears from the consciousness of a nation that for 200 years identified itself as being the nation of revolution, or nation of the revolution, if you like. This turn is a political turn. It's a conservative turn. It is a right-wing turn. It is a time when Le Pen starts to become more and more important in French politics. But it is also a time when French Communist Party, which was traditionally important, one of most important powers in French politics after the Second World War, loses its importance, loses its powers. During the 70s, Archipel Gulag was translated in French. And it has, one of the reactions was the crisis of Marxism as a theory and communism as a political praxis in the West. So the communism and Marxism disappear during the 70s, not only in France. What is more important, if you remember that actually 79, Margaret Thatcher becomes prime minister in Britain, that Deng Xiaoping wins his struggle against the so-called Gang of Four with Mao widow and introduces neoliberal reforms. So during these 70s, it's not what happens. General is, as Pierre Nora argues, general turn to the past. It is really very conservative also in the way how they were understanding revolution. They, in the 70s, the notion of terror becomes important. This is why we call it terrorism today. But originally, the notion of terror was coined by Thermidorians during the French Revolution. And it was coined against Jacobinians. It was very, very political concept. Had nothing to do with today's moralist way of thinking, of understanding the notion of terror. It was the way the concept of terror was used by one political option to against another political option. Thermidorians against Jacobinians. And it was very clear until the 90s what it was about, this difference. The Jacobinian concept of equality was universal equality. Thermidorian's concept of equality was the equality limited by property. This was at stake. This is where and how the notion of terror was coined. And today we talk so much about terrorism, about war on terror, obsessed with the terror in our moralist view, but we have forgotten the political logic of this concept. So, and at that time, what is also interesting, the French president, 1980, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, he proposed to dedicate himself to his country's national heritage. He's the first Western president who identified his role, his presidency, with taking care of culture of the past, of cultural heritage. So just imagine, a president, it was not only about social justice, how to organize welfare state, or economy, etc. He claimed that he is the curator of the past, precisely in terms of his promise to take care and preserve the past as the as the very essence, cultural heritage, very essence of French national identity. Put together, all these three phenomena, among many others, although not so powerful, mark the historical context of the memorialist trend, which was followed, especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall, by a worldwide upsurge in memory. And I quote Nora again, an ardent, embattled, almost fetishistic memorialism. However, his thesis that memory has replaced what was called history in the past doesn't necessarily imply that history has disappeared altogether. I quote just to why I'm quoting it, why I'm mentioning Nora and now Zygmunt Bauman. The turn to the past doesn't happen after September 11th. It is already old, and it has nothing to do specifically with contemporary art production. The whole world in the way, whole nations in the way how they understood themselves turned to the past, long before George Bush declared war on terror. And I quote from 1982, it is Zygmunt Bauman in his book Memories of Class, and he begins the book with the sentence, it reads, "Memory is the afterlife of history." So memory is a post-historical form of dealing not only with the past, but with the new experience of time, which clear differentiation and location of time, of the time dimensions of the past, the present, and the future is no longer possible. What we experience as a history that appears as a reborn. You know, this today. So many events, so many revolutions. Just think of all these revolutions in the last 10 or 15 years. First it was the democratic revolution, so-called, the fall of the communism. But then Orange Revolution, Rose Revolution in Ukraine, then it was Internet Revolution in Belgrade. The proliferation of these allegedly important events, but is this a rebirth of history? This is that, and I take the concept of Hartmut Rosa, a German sociologist, who works with the concept of acceleration. It has nothing to do with acceleration. You probably know something about. So all these, what appears for us today as the rebirth of history is an effect of an overall social acceleration that was diagnosed as one of the main features of modernity, and that has been, after 2000, pushed even further. Think of famous phrase, Frederick Jameson's phrase, time is today, I quote, time is today a function of speed and evidently perceptible only in terms of its rate of velocity as such. Everything is becoming faster and is in constant flux. What we perceive as a rebirth of history is in fact this push in acceleration of the late modernist time, of which Hartmut Rosa talked in his book Social Acceleration. But this push is counterbalanced with what Rosa calls crystallization of the cultural and structural formations of our age. Their idleness, immobility, time now appears, as he writes, as a sort of case or box as hard as steel. This is his metaphor, in which nothing can be changed and nothing new appears. In short, it seems at the same time that in our age, all the movements have come to their end, to a standstill. All the utopian energies have expired. All the options of ideas or of mind have been already tried. This condition culminates in Fukuyama's thesis on the end, it is 89, 25 years ago, the end of history, but is implied in all sorts of postisms that define our age ex negativo in terms of after, post, or end epoch, end of art, end of history, etc., etc. What this diagnosis differentiates from earlier diagnoses of historical terms is, according to Rosa, their asymmetry, or, as he also writes, their halfway character. At stake is the perception of an epochal change without a corresponding vision of a new cultural start, without a meaningful connection between the past, the present, and the future. It is, so to say, the perception of the epoch only as being old, without seeing anything new on the horizon. This is also to what Rochstetter refers. Rosa, however, there is one more historical transformation that has allowed for such an epochal turn to memory and heritage, a transformation that concerns our perception of history. The unity of historical time has been broken. The sense of continuity and permanence has been replaced by the experience of constant change. The present is now unable to connect the past with the future. We don't know what has to be saved from the past and preserved for our for future generation. Noha talks also of an inability to anticipate the future that imposes on us, and I quote, an obligation to stockpile in an indiscriminate fashion everything we believe might eventually testify to what we are or what we will have become. The stockpiling of memorabilia is accompanied with the feeling of loss and the exaggerated importance of memory, as well as the institutions and instruments that relate to it. Museums, archives, libraries, collections, databanks, etc. To put it short, art hasn't simply turned from one to another dimension of time, dimension of historical time. It hasn't trespassed any time difference, for the past doesn't appear to us in the form of time difference, but rather in the form of cultural difference. This is how we differentiate the past from the present, not by becoming aware of a difference in time, but becoming, or better, not becoming aware, but creating a cultural difference between the past and the present. The past appears to us as a foreign country. This is this famous sentence of novelist L.P. Hartley. He wrote in the novel The Go Between from '53, and the famous line reads, "The past is a foreign country. They do differently. They do things differently there." This is what memory deals with, and this is what, according to David Lowenthal, the theorist of the concept of cultural heritage, what the cultural heritage is about. It's about cultural difference. Art, therefore, doesn't obsessively look at the past, as Rochstetter claims. It produces this past in the form of memory. So it's not history what art produces. It is not a historiographic turn. It is not about retelling different histories, as Nakevicius, saving history from ideology. It is not what this problem is about. Art produces this past in the form of memory since it creates and recreates cultural differences. Behind art's obsession with the past, or as Rothstetter calls it, turn to the past, is in fact the change in the matter of its concern, which is now neither aesthetic nor political, but generally cultural. Art has become a mode of general cultural production in a very broad sense, which includes the production of time difference. Art doesn't look at the past. It makes the past out of everything, out of its own memory in terms of art history, or out of artifacts, of memories, or it transforms the public space into a cultural time space. It reenacts the past, but it doesn't look into the past. Since it doesn't look into the past, it cannot simply turn into different direction of time. In other words, there is no simple U-turn, a turn back from the past to the future, without challenging the total culturalization of what once was called historical experience. Yes. Yeah. Am I? Yes. Just to, I will put it very, very, very short with one element. As you know, one of the way of dealing with the past is performance. The performance has became so popular recently. Performance has entered museums, and you know all about reenactments. But my question is, what is the crucial? What is the essence of this performative turn, so to say? And I commenting generally on Rothstetter's claim that we have to turn to the future. As I said, it is impossible to think of this turn as a simply turn in terms of time to another time dimension. There is one turn that is in the history of philosophy very important, that has something to do with ideology. For sure you remember Althusser's famous example of an act of ideological interpellation. On the street, a police officer shouts at a person, "Hey, you there!" By mere response to this exclamation, by turning around for 180 degrees, a person becomes a subject within a given ideological frame, consisting of state ideological apparatuses. The person becomes a subject. But what is interesting, it is a move, it's a body movement. It is not cognitive transformation. It is not starting to think in, or reflect differently of the world, to accept other or reject some ideas. It is this move of the body. Can we now imagine as being addressed in a similar way in the world of post-history, in which, to quote Fukuyama, thinking and making art has been replaced by perpetual caretaking of the Museum of Human History. It is now one of these caretakers, a human embodiment of memory, who shouts at us, "Hey, you there!" By simply turning around, we too become subjects, not longer in a nation, society, or state, but in the Museum of History. We become subjects supposed not to create future, but to take care of the past. In short, any turn back from the past into the future must be an ideological turn. and it must have political consequences. It is not simply a matter of choice. It is a political turn, and it must imply a relation to certain legacy. This legacy doesn't have to be an exclusively ideological or political legacy. It could also be a legacy in terms of art history, or better, of a history of art that has come to its end. To quote Frederick Jameson, the difference between the theory of an end of art and of an end of history is a difference in political stance. The first, the concept of the end of art is a left-wing concept, in contrast to the right wing of the end of history. So, any turn to the future presupposes a turn either to the left or to the right, a turn that cannot be ideologically and politically neutral, a turn that cannot repeat those famous words of Patti Smith, "I'm an artist and I'm not guilty." One cannot turn to the future and stay innocent. And then, since it is quite long, it's much about Hegel, I will end quoting Hegel from his phenomenology of spirit. And this is like the last sentence of my comment on Rohrstedter claim to the future, so to say. Only a stone is innocent, not even a child. This is Hegel's word. So there is no possibility to turn back from the future, from the past to the future without losing innocence, political and ideological. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a really fascinating talk, and very provocative actually also. I'm very aware it's very perverse use of all talks to be so pressed for time. I think we should open it out just in case there's a couple of really burning questions. They've got to be good ones, comments. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I just wondered if you had any opinions about what's happening in Ukraine at the moment and kind of the policy of Russia. It seems to be that there's a little story that came out from, is it Nathan Dubrovsky, who is a pseudonym for someone else, the Russian first minister or something like that. I can't remember. Which was about war changing from a kind of black and white into a kind of multi-dimensional thing where you kind of exist as a homogenous place where people can't kind of give you a determined function. It's the way that Russia are kind of working in the Ukraine is they're there fighting, but they're like, no, I'm not really there, and there's no way of really determining whether they are or not. And it seems to be that, to me, that's a kind of function of historiality, like there's no way of really defining their place. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
It's a good example which demonstrates actually how ambiguous is this whole story about obsession with the past. Look, in Ukraine there is probably you remember a year ago these first protests in the east before the war started. While in the West Ukraine, there were, they toppled down Lenin monuments. At the same time, in the eastern part of so-called Russian-speaking part, which is wrong, but Russian-speaking part, they were protecting, gathering around these monuments and protecting these monuments. So this is possible only as a general misunderstanding of history and general oblivion. Why? Because actually Lenin was creator. Lenin, in his anti-Russian, anti-imperialist policy, he launched the so-called politics of Koreanization, as they called it at that time. He liberated Ukrainian nation. It was the Bolshevik project, and actually the Ukrainian state is a Bolshevik project. So, while the Russian imperialists, and these are these days those who fight in the eastern part, it should be precisely the other way around. Those in the West should protect Lenin monuments, while those in the East should topple down Lenin. But you know what happened to Lenin? What is Lenin? He has lost any historical meaning. Lenin is alive only as a piece of Russian cultural heritage. This is really the real death of Lenin, where there is no political meaning whatsoever in his symbolic figure. It is simply a piece of cultural heritage, and as such is protected. He has become something Russian. So that this war, it seems as though it is all about past. You have these ghosts of fascists, communists, etc. But in fact, so the whole conflict is obsessed with the past. But actually, this obsession is a form of oblivion. No knowledge whatsoever of what really happened in the past.
Any more?
I could add, that all this dealing of art with the past doesn't necessarily make us or improves our knowledge of the past. It could, in a similar way, improve our oblivion.
Hi, I just wanted to ask you if you could talk a bit more about the embodiment part, which you kind of rushed into at the end, because it seems like quite an important point. That maybe is a different approach to history, or what that might mean.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate?
I skipped the whole story about performance and history, and the need to use body movements as an element in dealing with the past. What I wanted to say, this is why I quoted Althusser, is that these body movements are not innocent ideologically. This is my point. It is not only about authenticity of what has happened, or about remembering of what has happened. Performativity wants to take stance. This is why it is so performative. And my point is that we should go in thinking, in reflecting on critically reflecting on, for instance, reenactments. We should search this ideological and political element behind. This is what the movement, what body movement is about. This is the point. This is why I use the concept of Althusser, because becoming a subject in this metaphor is really a turn of the body. It's not a change of mind. It's not about this or that ideas. It is something very, very positive.
I'm really sorry to cut it short. Thank you all for your patience. I know it's a bit away, and it's frustrating not to be able to carry on this conversation, but there are other chances with Boris this week, so please come on Saturday to the Formal West. And to the pub now, also, which we will try and pull Boris to as well for a drink. So thank you again for waiting, and thank you very much to Boris.
Thank you for being here.